Good morning and welcome to the National Security Space Association Space Time interview series. We're glad to have you with us today. My name is Chris Williams and I have the privilege of serving as chair of the NSSA Studies and Analysis Center. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, this Space Time interview series is a forum through which we hear directly from key officials responsible for various missions and functions across the U.S. national security space enterprise. In the recent past, we have interviewed Vice Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General John Hyten, Ann Neuberger, who recently departed her job as head of the Cybersecurity Directorate at NSA to become the Deputy National Security Advisor for President Biden, Dr. Scott Pace, who served as Executive Secretary of the National Space Council, and many others. We also recently held the association's second annual Classified Space Threats Conference. This very informative event was held online due to COVID restrictions. We have several additional classified online events coming up in the next few weeks. For example, this coming Tuesday, February the 9th at 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, the association will host Dr. Sean Kirkpatrick, the Deputy J2 and DNI representative to U.S. Space Command, for a classified online session. Stay tuned for more information on this and other upcoming events. We're deeply honored to have with us today Mr. John Paul Parker, the Intelligence Community Space Executive and National Intelligence Manager for Space within the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. In this capacity, Mr. Parker, or JP as he is known, is the Principal Advisor to the Director of National Intelligence on space policy matters affecting the intelligence community, and he leads the enterprise-wide integration of the IC's analytic, collection, counterintelligence, governance, strategy, and acquisition activities related to space and counterspace. In other words, JP provides leadership on a broad range of space issues, including IC space budgets, policies, and programs. He plays a central role in promoting collaboration and integration of IC and Department of Defense space programs and activities, as called for in Space Policy Directive Number 4, one of the several topics we'll get into momentarily. Previously, JP served as Special Advisor to Vice President Pence for space, cyber, intelligence, weapons of mass destruction, and science and technology. He represented the Vice President on all national security space matters and was instrumental in reestablishing the National Space Council and drafting the national strategy for space. Until 2017, Mr. Parker was the founding technical director of the Intelligence Community Security Coordination Center, which directs and coordinates the cyber defense of the previously 17 organizations comprising the U.S. intelligence community, and which is one of the 7 presidentially designated federal cybersecurity centers. In 2012, Mr. Parker was selected to serve a 2-year term as a senior fellow in the first ever Strategic Studies Group, which provides independent, unconventional, and innovative analysis and recommendations directly to the Chief of Staff of the U.S. Army. His previous private sector experience includes management positions at BAE Systems, General Dynamics, Veridian, and Pacific Sierra Research. Previous government experience includes professional staff member on the House Armed Services Committee and the U.S. Government Accountability Office. Very briefly, just a quick word about our format. JP has graciously agreed to provide some introductory comments, then we'll turn to a Q&A session. If members of the audience have questions for JP, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. Given time constraints, I can't promise you I'll get to all your questions, but I'll certainly try. JP, thanks again for making time to be with us today. We know your time is valuable and we're honored that you chose to spend it with us. And on a personal level, I deeply appreciate your devotion to our nation's security and our friendship that dates back to our time together spent on the professional staff of the House Armed Services Committee. You're a true patriot, JP. Thanks for your time. And sir, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Chris. I appreciate it. I hope you can all hear me okay. This is groundbreaking for me in a number of ways. Number one, we're not Zoom enabled in the intelligence community, so I've had to relocate to the undisclosed location. It is the International Space Station. I can reveal that now, as you can see behind me here. There's no affiliation between the ISS and the intelligence community. Let me make that clear right up front. No, but in all seriousness, we traditionally don't do things like this. And so I've chosen to kind of come out with NSSA because traditionally we would be operating in the shadows and not have a lot to say publicly. But we think the importance of space and its evolution over the last few years, and hopefully where we're going, requires a much broader and deeper dialogue amongst those of us, not just in the national security community, but the broader audience in the American public. So we're trying to get as much information and messaging out as we can. We think there's a great story to be told, and we're doing our best to try to tell it. I want to thank NSSA and Chris and the team. They came to me a couple of years ago and said that they were going to create this association focused on space. And I said, we have a lot of associations and many of them claim to have very deep space expertise. But I am frankly amazed and heartened by how far NSSA has come in such a short period of time. I was looking at the sign-up sheet and I recognized many friends, many colleagues who hopefully are out there online right now. And I think it's a testament to NSSA that you guys have pulled together the coalition of the willing on space to elevate the importance of space and to make clear that it needs a national focus, and that transcends boundaries to include beyond the national security community. And I see many friends who are traditionally mavens in space, but I also hopefully see some newcomers who NSSA is pulling in for their contributions to helping make space the great priority that it needs to be. So thank you to NSSA for this opportunity. And excuse me if I stumble a little bit. We're not used to Zoom live chatting with people in the public domain. So with that, I thought I would keep it very, very brief, my opening comments. And what I'm going to focus on here for just a minute or two, and I'm unfortunately going to read to you because it can't be said any better than the way the DNI said it at the National Space Council meeting here just at the beginning of December. And that's an example of where we have a public platform, and it's important for us in the national security community to try to broaden the debate away from our narrow equities and into a broader discussion about how important space is, because we think that's the big debate that needs to take place. And so I'm just going to quote a few sentences from the DNI's testimony as kind of a stage setter for how we tend to think about space. By almost any measure, the dramatic increase in space-related capabilities and services over the past decade have been game changers with profound implications for life on Earth. Over 80 nations operate in space, and 50 countries have dedicated government budgets for space. Governments are not the only players in space. Dozens of new commercial space companies have emerged with plans to launch tens of thousands of new satellites in the coming years, more than all the satellites launched since the dawn of the space age. Over the past 5 years, US companies have launched more commercial remote sensing satellites into orbit than the rest of the world combined. Today, that trend is reversing. Our colleagues at the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency predict that in this decade, the rest of the world will launch at least twice as many commercial remote sensing satellites as the United States. Economically, the global space industry has grown rapidly in recent years and is approaching $500 billion in annual revenue. But more critical is that broad sectors of the US economy have come to rely on space-related capabilities. Estimates suggest that industries with reliance on space-based services contribute over $5 trillion of our annual gross domestic product. Simply put, we depend on space systems as critical infrastructure directly supporting the American way of life. If these space-based services are disrupted, we could see adverse effects on nearly all sectors of the US economy, including consumer supply chains, transportation, telecommunications, agriculture, and finance. To me, that summarizes the importance aspect of it, and now I'm hoping to unpack a discussion about not only the national security specific elements of it, but how those occur across all sectors of America's way of life. Chris, over to you.
Thank you. Great lead in. One recent event I think that's was very newsworthy and got a lot of attention. The U.S. Space Force element recently acceded as the 18th official member of the U.S. intelligence community. What necessitated this event, and can you tell us a little bit about what that means in a practical sense? You know, why was this necessary?
Yeah, thank you, Chris. For my guardians who might be out there listening to this, congratulations. It's been an amazing ride. I think a wise person, and I've said this to you, Chris, a couple times, I think a wise person going back 2.5 years ago would have been completely legitimately betting against the idea that we would overcome institutional lethargy and create an entire military service based on space. But we did that. It was done in a couple of years' time. And I commend my colleagues at the Pentagon, on Capitol Hill, and throughout government who supported that effort, because it was a huge lift and a historic once-in-a-lifetime lift. So the creation of the Space Force, I think, solidifies the idea of the value of space to national security. And the mission of the Space Force, I think General Raymond and even General Hyten have talked about it. It's still an educational process because of how fast this emerged. But what I just described in my opening comments is really the predicate for why we need a Space Force. America's way of life has become increasingly dependent on space, and we need to understand that that has become a contested environment. It is not a sanctuary and a high ground that we alone occupy and can operate with impunity. There are those, and I think we'll talk about it here today, who understand the importance of space to the American way of life and are actively plotting on how to disrupt and degrade that. So the Space Force has the mission of protecting us in space. A huge element of that is the intelligence that will support their mission. When we looked at the creation of the Space Force, it was pretty obvious to us that they were a candidate to join the intelligence community because we had 17 members, including all the military services. So the creation of a new military service obviously sets the ball in motion for making them a member of the intelligence community. And I think we'll talk in this discussion here about all the things that we're doing with the Space Force and Space Command. But the key thing that caused us to move quickly was the fact that Air Force Space and the intelligence pieces of that had now transferred away from the Air Force into the new organization known as the United States Space Force. From a finance and from a responsibilities and accountability standpoint, that meant to keep those elements in the intelligence community, we have to assess the Space Force into the IC. So really the urgency for doing it is the fact that if we didn't do it, Air Force space intelligence things that were previously in the intelligence community would actually be outside. And we need that continuity. We need that partnership to be fully developed, and we need to go forward rather than backward. And so making them the 18th member of the intelligence community was an obvious and logical thing to do. We had a signing ceremony on January 8th. General Raymond and Major General Leah Lauterbach, who is now officially designated as the head of the IC element, known as the United States Space Force, and its ISR component, is now officially a part of the Space Force. We had the honor of having her receive her first letter of instruction from the DNI. The DNI gave her, and she signed a letter on January 8th at the signing ceremony that instructed her as the newest member of the Space Force to go off and prepare a plan that understands all the IC's requirements and presents back to the DNI this coming June a plan for where we are in compliance and where things need to be improved. And she's basically been given an open license to talk openly with the DNI about all the things that could be done better and all the things that are being done very well between the United States Space Force and the intelligence community. So we're excited by that, and we're very proud to have them.
That's fantastic. I should mention to our viewers that General Lauterbach has agreed to appear at a future Space Time event as well, and we'll get back to you with the exact date and time for that. We're looking forward to having Leah on Space Time soon. And congratulations, that's a big move. Next question for you is, you mentioned this is somewhat unusual for you and the IC to be in a public forum like this. Can you tell us a little bit more about the duties of the now combined IC Space Executive and the National Intelligence Manager for Space position? How much influence do you have over issues like allocation of scarce resources? And to what extent will you help drive intelligence collection and analysis on foreign space and counter space threats?
Yeah, thank you, Chris. I'm still getting my feet under me. We recently combined, for those of you who know the intelligence community and how we've been structured, I'll go backward and explain how it was, and then I'll describe where it is now and then where I think it's going to go. We have always had for many, many years a national intelligence manager, and the NIM, as we call it, is the chief and principal advisor to the DNI on things in their portfolio. Most of the NIMs are regionally focused. We have a NIM for Russia and a NIM for East Asia, et cetera. And the emergence of what we call domain or functional NIMs over the years has provided an opportunity for a focus on space. And so we've had a NIM for space and technical intelligence, but traditionally that person was dual-hatted with another function we have in the intelligence community called the NIO. The NIO is the National Intelligence Officer for Space. I saw Larry Gershwin had registered for this. I hope you're out there, Larry. Larry is the emeritus chair of all things space in the intelligence community. He has tutored me and mentored many throughout the space community, both in the IC and elsewhere. But Larry was wearing both of those hats, the NIM and the NIO, for many, many years. In 2018, there was a recognition that the policy initiatives being undertaken at the White House were going to result in a substantial increase in the importance of space, and it was going to impact national security space and the intelligence community in general. And so the leadership at DNI at the time decided to create a new office, the Office of the Space Executive. And the Office of the Space Executive was designed to take into account all the emerging issues related to the policy development underway, such as the creation of the National Space Council, the reestablishment of the Space Command, and the potential creation of a new military service on space. And so the NIM function and the Space Executive function were combined here very recently. And so the Office of the Space Executive plus the National Intelligence Manager for Space is the office I now run. I work very closely with Larry, who retains his NIO focus, and Larry is the chief analyst for all things space in the intelligence community. And so one of my jobs now as the NIM is to make sure we are collecting the information that Larry can fully exploit in order to inform decision-making about the threats. And so that now is going to be a very strong focus of what I'm going to be doing in the year or two. But the Space Executive job was to take care of all the issues that are not collection and analytically related. And so if you think back on the last 3 years, we have had an enormous push to elevate the importance of space. And I think it kept us very busy over the last 3 years working in my office. But if you look at the development of this Space Council as an example, which was a whole of government integration of space policy development, huge lift and a remarkably successful run. If you look at the reestablishment of US Space Command, you mentioned Dr. Kirkpatrick is going to be, I think, a guest in one of your upcoming discussions. Well, Dr. Kirkpatrick is our DNI representative to US Space Command. We placed Sean Kirkpatrick out there specifically to be dual-hatted. So he's not only the DNI rep, he is also the Deputy J2 for US Space Command. That's a unique arrangement, but it reflected that 2 years ago, we needed to think differently and act differently in order to fully synergize all the space-related activities that are happening within the IC and DoD. That's just one example. We have dozens and dozens of other examples that I think we'll talk about today. You talked about resources and prioritization. It has always been the role and the responsibility of the NIM to look across the IC space enterprise, look at prioritization and leadership intent, figure out where we have gaps and address those, and bolster where we see successes with additional resources and focus. And so that continues to be an area that we will look at going forward. The decision-making process in the intelligence community with regard to prioritization and allocation of resources, I think what I would tell the audience out there is if you don't know it, it's a little different than you might expect. The intelligence community is not a department. We don't have one unitary department head who has command and control authority over all the subordinate elements. The elements, as we call them, of the intelligence community very often have multiple missions and multiple reporting chains. A huge amount of the intelligence community also is co-resident within the Department of Defense. And when you lay out the now 18 members, what the role of the DNI is to look across that enterprise space and in a collaborative and conciliatory fashion, figure out how to take into account all the different mission requirements and priorities while also making sure national priorities, as reflected in the DNI's charter, are being taken care of. So I have a role, I have a seat at the table when it comes to resource allocation, but our agencies have a lot of independence, which is the way we like it, because it allows them to move fast and retain some of their autonomy in order to execute missions the best way that they see fit. And so we do budget reviews and we have a lot of budget control at DNI, but with the Department of Defense, we actually anticipate a lot of joint budget deliberations going forward. And I think one of the themes you're going to see on the classified side going forward is a lot of desire to combine programs and do joint programs with the Department of Defense, which means there'll be a lot of voices about how to prioritize those. But we have a collaborative governance structure rather than a command and control governance structure. And I think it leads to very good outcomes, although it can be time consuming.
That's great. Thank you. You staffed several directors of national intelligence or DNIs for National Space Council meetings and led various follow-up actions within the IC. In your opinion, what was the impact of the National Space Council in providing guidance and oversight of the nation's national security space enterprise? And what do you see as the most noteworthy changes in policy and strategy to emerge from the council? And where do we stand as an enterprise in terms of implementation of those changes? You know, where are we in the journey, if you will?
That's a great question. I think I should fully disclose that I was at the White House when the council was established, so I'm not a disinterested observer. In fact, one of the first jobs I was handed when I was at the White House was to get on a teleconference with the members from the House Armed Services Committee to help explain why the administration would not support the creation of a Space Corps, which had been proposed in legislation previously. And so the evolution from 2017 to 2020 on how much changed, I think in part was due to the implementation of the Space Council. The Space Council, in my estimation, did a wonderful job of what the Vice President wanted it to do, which was whole of government integration of space. And I think if you look at the guiding hand, the leadership exhibited by the Vice President, it's not incidental to the success of the Space Council. You had a national leader in the form of the Vice President who developed a council for the express purpose of amplifying the importance of space, and the council was the mechanism for doing that. And so whether you look at the council meetings that were held, if you look at the field trips that were taken by the Vice President to go find out what was in the space portfolio, his overriding concern is that we not segment our space policy development into three separate buckets, that we not have NASA for civilian and civil space, that we not have commerce for private sector encouragement of a commercial space sector, and that we not have a national security space sector all operating completely independently. The premise of the council is to look for the synergy that occurs at the national level by thinking of all of those things as all crucial elements of national power, and the ability to share and compare across those sectors, I think, is going to be a crucial element of bolstering our economic as well as our national security going forward. And so I commend the council for everything it did. I'm very gratified to see here in the last month or two, a lot of organizations are coming out in support of what the council did and recommending that the council go forward, which of course I support too. I think as a forum for national level deliberation and understanding where the seams and the gaps are in the way we develop policy and execute strategy, I think the council has been absolutely instrumental.
That's very helpful. And I should point out that the National Security Space Association, in a report to the incoming Biden transition team, explicitly called out the National Space Council and urged them to retain the council as the primary point of contact for integrating space policy and strategy across those sectors, as you just mentioned.
I think the track record, Chris, is kind of speaks for itself. I know I saw Scott Pace had registered for this. I hope he's out there. He deserves a huge debt of gratitude from all of us in the space domain, as well as the nation, for pulling together in a really cohesive, well-coordinated and bipartisan way why space is important and what we need to do going forward. I will tell you just a couple of anecdotes from my time working with the council. Many of the key policy development initiatives that we now have under our belt. We've got a new national space policy, which was signed into effect here just in this past December, first major rewrite in a decade plus. We had a classified national space security strategy that was signed in 2018. You saw space policy directives. I've lost count. There's been so many. I think Scott shot for the record in terms of policy directives on space and overachieved on that. But in all of those, I think what you'll find from the participants and the observers is that consensus was built, coordination was not contentious, and I can speak to at least a couple of these documents having gone all the way up through interagency coordination, in which the secretaries and the principals, as well as the White House, and to include the president and vice president, all were given paper PCs rather than contentious live debates and deliberations. And I think that's a testament to the way the Space Council conducted its business, which was collaborative, open, and very deliberative, such that the paperwork, when it ended up in the principal's inboxes ready for signature, did not require live meetings. A lot of these things were adjudicated without contention. And I think a lot of these policy documents reflect deep consensus on what we need to do. And they were not done in a contentious fashion.
Right. You have been deeply involved in efforts to promote closer integration between the Department of Defense and the intelligence community on various space activities and organizations. How has this played out over the last several years? What do you see as the biggest accomplishments in this area, and what work remains? I would specifically point you to Space Policy Directive 4 in this regard, and if you could address that in your comments, that'd be helpful as well.
Sure, thank you. I've spent an inordinate amount of my time outside of my building and in the Department of Defense because the partnership between the IC and DoD is paramount in my mind. When Space Policy Directive 4 came out, it resolved a long-standing deliberation, or really heated discussion, I would say, that had gone on for many, many years about the dividing lines between the intelligence community and the Department of Defense. And to my way of thinking, I kind of inherited this debate and I heard a lot about it. But for many, many decades, there was contention over the Title 10 DoD authorities and the Title 50 intelligence community authorities. And then the creation of spacecraft and space fleets to serve both of those mission areas, it always seemed to be debated that they might be in contention. But the truth of the matter is, it's not a divisive issue, it's a multiplier for the nation's strength if we come together. And I think what SPD4 did is it resolved the debate once and for all by saying, we're not going to pick one over the other, and we're not going to subordinate one over the other. Both national missions, defense and intelligence, are absolutely vital. And if they come together, we're unbeatable in space. And so the SPD4 codified that, but it also directed both the defense and the intelligence community to get together and talk about not where the dividing lines are, but tell the White House all the things we are going to do together explicitly going forward. I take great satisfaction in that because I read a lot of articles from people who had access to Grind about organizational alignments and who should report to whom. And I didn't think that was beneficial either to America and the public or to our adversaries who watch that. And one of the things I think we have tried to do substantively and then message is the fact that DoD and the IC, the leadership all the way down the ranks now understand to prevail in space, it's going to be a full team effort. We're not going to divide, we're going to unify. And so we put together a report, a classified report for the president. Those working groups came together. They split apart so the DoD can focus on what it thought its priorities were. IC members from all the agencies got together and did the same thing. And then we got together and we jammed those things together. There was about 55 good ideas that came out of that process. But I can tell you, almost without dispute, it was the ability of the joint DoD-IC working community that said, we need to whittle this down so that we have a prioritization that we can focus on. Some of these are good ideas that can be taken offline, but we committed jointly to the president in writing, these 12 ideas are game changers, and if we can succeed, we'll be unbeatable in space. And so those 12 ideas became the roadmap for what we're doing jointly. If you look at the Space Command as an example, I mentioned earlier that we put a DNI representative out at US Space Command. That hadn't been done before. The DNI rep is usually a person who's assigned to the command, but in this case, in conjunction and in discussions with General Raymond, who at the time was commander of US Space Command, we made that person the Deputy J2. So having that person be dual-hatted as both the Deputy J2 and the DNI rep is a level of interoperability and situational awareness that hadn't been done before, but it was an experiment. We wanted to try it. I would say it's proven to be very valuable. And so the theme of a lot of what we're trying are experiments that may have been discounted before, but that we think are worth trying. And the one that I think is probably on a lot of people's minds because we made quite a big deal out of it in summer of 2019, we announced that we would experiment with a new concept of operations for how we're going to defend assets in space jointly between the NRO and US Space Command. And I would tell you, the leadership determined that it absolutely has to happen. We have to have a united front in the defense of our space assets. The NRO, as you know, is a significant player in space. We operate our own fleet of spacecraft for national intelligence purposes alongside the DoD assets in space. and having one unified defensive concept of operations was realized to be a mandate. And so, to their credit, Space Command and NRO, along with participation by other elements in DoD and those of us at the DNI, have been embarked on a series of war games. And what those are doing are stress testing all the different ways we could combine and basically present a united defensive front. And so that campaign of experimentation and learning is underway. It's going to yield a new concept of operations for how we jointly defend our stuff in space. And it's one of many examples, I think, that you're going to see that's new and brings the IC and DoD together.
That's great, JP. Thank you. And just as a brief follow-on, a question from the audience, in this case, General Lester Lyles. He asks, JP, do you see any challenges to the interface between the IC space community and the U.S. Space Force? And a related question, do you see the possibility of the NRO becoming a part of the Space Force in the future? And thank you, General Lyles, for your participation today and your question.
Thank you, General Lyles. It's good to hear from you. The short answer to your question, General Lyles, is no. I do not see the NRO becoming part of the Space Force. We looked at it intently throughout 2018 and into 2019, and the Space Policy Directive number 4 concluded that the NRO would not be part of the Space Force. The mission of the NRO is radically different than the mission of the United States Space Force. The ability to work together collaboratively on, for example, areas of common interest such as acquisition and requirements, that's a fact, and that will happen no matter what alignment occurs. But the NRO has a national intelligence collection mission, distinct and different from the Space Force's protect and defend mission. Space Force, as a organized, train, and equip organization within the Department of Defense, should be creating capabilities for Space Command to defend our assets in space. The NRO's primary focus is on the national intelligence mission and support to DoD from an intelligence collection standpoint. Very different mission, and where they come together is in a variety of forums and initiatives to include joint programs with the Space Force. And I will tell you that without getting into the classified details, in the next year or 18 months, we will more than double our joint programs. And I mean formally joint, in which requirements from the Space Force, requirements from the intelligence community are put together into one notional area and then jointly executed as a function of perhaps a joint program office. Those are increasing because of the need to achieve the synergy there. Requirements and acquisition is going to be an area. And then, of course, coordinating the defense of all the assets in space is something that is better focused on Space Command's mission rather than the Space Force. So we're supporting multiple organizations in a variety of ways. And I would say the challenges, to get to your first part of your question, General Lyles, are cultural. The DoD is structured and operates very differently than we do in the intelligence community. And those are cultural and linguistic issues that can be overcome. So right now, OPTs, operational planning teams, are working hard to bring both the relevant DoD people and the relevant IC people into the room to discuss, debate, experiment, and then come up with a joint capability. But the challenges have been on, what do you mean when you say a playbook for space? It's an actual example. We went to a meeting to monitor what was going on with Space Command and the NRO, and they said, sir, in the DNI's testimony, he talked about developing a joint playbook. Well, we don't have playbooks in doctrine, and so we've debated what a playbook is. And we've told them very directly, we chose that word very deliberately. We didn't pick a word out of DoD doctrine, nor did we pick a word out of the IC vernacular. We wanted the practitioners to get together and say, if conflict comes to space, what should the plan look like, and how collaborative should it be? But we've left it up to you to figure out what that is. So don't fall back on your traditional terms and ways of doing business. Get together, collaborate, and come up with something new. And I think you'll find a receptive audience in the leadership. I go to all the Joint Space Warfighting Forums, which are jointly chaired between General Dickinson at Space Command and the NRO director. And they are absolutely overwhelmingly positive. They are producing really breakthrough ideas, and there's really no contention. I think the contention phase of getting together has come and gone.
That's great. Thank you. And again, thank you, General Lyles, for your question. Speaking of threats, Generals Raymond and Dickinson have publicly highlighted recent threatening on-orbit behavior by Russian and Chinese spacecraft. What are you able to say today about those particular events, as well as the broader trends in space threats to on-orbit systems?
Bluntly speaking, China is continuing to build out as a national priority its space capabilities and its capabilities to negate our dominance in space. There's just no doubt about it. I would, from an unclassified standpoint, I highly commend people take a look at two publications that the community has put out over the last couple of years. The NASIC publication, Competing in Space, it's available on the web. They've done a good job of creating a compendium of what our adversaries are doing, in as much as we can say in an unclassified forum. But you don't have to read too finely between the lines to understand what they're doing and the scope of what they're doing. And the DIA publication, Challenges to Security in Space. I don't have them to hold up right here, but I traditionally have them wherever I go, because I commend them to everybody. They're available on the web. You can Google those and pull them down for yourself and read at least an unclassified version of what the intelligence community views. Larry Gershwin, I'll give...
just briefly interrupt. We recently had a classified online session with John Huth from DIA and Jeff Gossel, presenting a classified update to NSSA member companies on space threats as well. Forgive the interruption, JP.
No, and that's a great shout out. I should have mentioned their names particularly. Jeff and John are key proponents behind these products and all the other products that are being produced to try to inform people. And I'll tip my hat back to Larry Gershwin if he's out there. If you've read the DNI's annual threat assessment, and this is a credit to Larry, Larry has always made sure to include in public forums the DNI's constant drumbeat about adversary behavior and capabilities, which have only increased the threat to us going back many, many years. And Larry has been beating that drum for many, many years, and I think now it's more widely understood. This was not a flash in the pan. This was not a trend or a fad on the part of our adversaries. Our adversaries know our way of life depends on it. Our national security is predicated on our ability to operate freely in space and take full advantage of the capabilities we have in space. And they absolutely intend to not let us have that advantage going forward. The Russians, and I'll commend General Raymond for being very outspoken about this. If you go back over the course of last year, you will see tweets and press releases from Space Command, where he was at the time, in which he called out Russian irresponsible behavior. The Russians are testing weapons in space. We've said it. They do it in a provocative manner. They do it despite the fact that in international forums at the United Nations, they claim to want to have a weapon-free space environment, but they continue to build and test weapons in space. There's no doubt about it. The Chinese view dominance in space as key to their national strategy over the long term, and so they're continuing to produce an entire array of capabilities to not only assert their dominance in space, but negate ours. And I commend you to those products, as well as some think tank products, which I think do a pretty good job of documenting what they're doing out there.
That's great. What's the status of establishing a National Space Intelligence Center? When might that occur, and what will the responsibilities of the center be? And where will the financial resources and the personnel come from to populate that center?
Yeah, so commensurate with the creation of the United States Space Force, all military services have a service intel center. When we had a United States Air Force that covered down on space, a center of gravity for that activity would have been at National Air and Space Intelligence Center. With the creation of the United States Space Force and the desire to have their own Service Intelligence Center, a decision was made to build out what we're calling an NSIC, a National Space Intelligence Center. That would be co-located, is the current plan, at NASIC, and would take full advantage of all the space and counter space capabilities that are resident at Dayton. The planning right now is underway for the scope of that and what the requirements would be.
That's great, thank you. The National Security Space Association Studies and Analysis Center issued a report on the need for reforming governance and modernizing security processes and policies. What can you tell our audience about efforts to rationalize security policies across the intelligence community?
Huge question. and traditionally that's been a sticky wicket to navigate. So I took the job of space executive in middle of 2018, Chris, and you and I have had discussions over this period of time, and I think I would have told you very early on, boy, is that something somebody needs to fix. But I'm glad I've got all this space policy development to focus on and Space Council initiatives to focus myself on, because boy, that has been tried and failed in the past. So over the course of a few months, I came to realize that a lot of what we want to do in terms of collaborating more deeply with DoD are going to require some reform and security. The administrative burdens are legitimate if you're a security officer, but they're an impediment and burdensome if you're a mission-focused person who either wants to build a program jointly with DoD or wants to get out on the floor of the National Space Defense Center, where we're going to have joint, interoperable, and fully coordinated defensive actions taking place. We can't have security be the impediment to seamless integration. On October 25th, the principal executive, who's the number 2 in the DNI, signed out an approval for my integrated space portfolio. And the integrated space portfolio basically in one fell swoop combines all the IC's compartmented space programs into one construct. And the reason we did that is not only to ease the information sharing across the IC.
That's very helpful. And please keep the association in mind. A number of our member companies are deeply involved in these activities and are on the receiving end of both the policies and practices, and are very keen to explore opportunities to reform those systems. So congratulations on the work you're doing there, and keep us informed, if you will, please. That's great. Well, industry is clearly a partner on this, and so look forward to working with you closely on it. I'm going to continue sort of bouncing around here in our limited time and turn to another topic. How effectively does the IC leverage U.S. commercial space companies for various intelligence purposes, such as space domain awareness and launch and other activities? And what more can be done in this area? There's a lot of lamenting the fact that there are capabilities that are not being leveraged as effectively as they could. But what's being done about that, especially in the IC?
Yeah, it's a huge area of interest of ours. And the new national space policy, and I think it was predicated in prior versions of policy documents coming out, continues to focus on commercial space as a pillar and an element of national power. And so what I would say in summary, and then I'll go back through some details for you, is that we recognize that we're moving out, and I think you're seeing across the board a recognition that we need to take advantage of commercial space capabilities better. We are, much more to be done, but we're also going to make sure we do what we can to support the development of a robust commercial space industry. And I'll unpack why that's important to us in just a moment. We spent a lot of time over the last year working with our colleagues in the Department of Defense and at the Department of Commerce on regulatory reform. It was a push from the White House that we streamline regulations regarding the development of commercial remote sensing industry. There were a lot of complaints over the years that the Department of Defense and the intelligence community were using national security reasons, and it was having a deleterious impact on the development of emerging capabilities because they might potentially impact national security. So our thinking is changing, and we're adapting ourselves to the fact that across the board in the United States and in foreign markets, ubiquitous overhead sensing is a fact of life now and will only increase in the future. We're seeing a proliferation of capabilities not only to remotely sense things on Earth, but to do non-Earth imaging, to conduct space operations other than imaging, to include RF collection from space. We're seeing the ability of the emergence of capabilities to do on-orbit servicing. And the commercial exploitation of space is something we need to actually bolster and support. Why is that important? Number one, many of those capabilities might have intelligence community requirements embedded in them, in the sense that we can take advantage of them and take something off the shelf and potentially use it. We're looking at how to do that. In 2019, the ODNI spent considerable amount of money looking at what we call the small sat acceleration, the ability to take small satellites in and adapt them for use for an intelligence community mission. We did a survey and we targeted academia, small business, and the commercial marketplace to kind of get our view broadened about what's out there, what's emerging. And then we brought our community experts together from all the agencies to say, how could you take advantage of this? It was very eye-opening. If you look at what the NRO is doing, they're moving to a hybrid architecture, and their new architecture and constellation will take advantage of proliferation of smaller and more numerous things that are highly leveraging commercial best practices, commercial technology, and commercial product lines. And so I think we are moving in that direction. We understand it. Switching back to the regulatory reform, we worked very closely to push Commerce and DoD into a position in which we would have to understand the emergence of technology and not necessarily default to try to constrict the development of commercial capabilities. And so we don't think the government should be in the position of restricting the development of technologies. We need reasonable protections for national security purposes, but we don't think that means handcuffing private industry. The reason that's important is because we can clearly see the emergence of a foreign commercial space marketplace. So the more restrictions we put on our domestic providers, the more we are hamstringing them against an emerging commercial global marketplace in which foreign competitors are showing up with very, very significant capabilities to do things from space. And so I think the new rule and its implementation as it's being rolled out now as we speak, I think if what I'm hearing from industry, it is far more tolerable than it used to be. And the intelligence community is adapting to the fact that we need to change our ways and not only take advantage of those capabilities, but not try to restrict them before they get launched, but merely adapt to that.
That's very helpful. And on the same topic of your engagement with the commercial sector, our audience is keen to learn more about the IC Commercial Space Council, which was recently stood up, the charter was signed, et cetera. What are the primary function and objectives of the council, and how can the U.S. private sector engage with the council going forward? And I should note, you and I have had many conversations on this, and the association is happy to play a role in some of those activities going forward.
The first thing I think I should say about it is the council is absolutely a reflection of what we just talked about. My small team has spent considerable amount of time over the last year and a half trying to figure out what the IC and the intelligence community nexus ought to be with the commercial space industry. I cited it in the DNI's testimony earlier. It's a game changer for the nation. So we know it's here to stay, and it's going to become an ever important part of our economic as well as our national security. So what does the IC need to do to adapt to take advantage of that? We knew we needed to have a forum for debating, deliberating, and guiding our agencies in that regard. And that was part of the rationale for creating the Commercial Space Council. The one thing I would say that might be a little misleading to folks, especially who are reading about this in industry, is that you may think from the name that this is a council whereby commercial space organizations come to talk to the IC about their capabilities and what we might be doing to procure that. That's not actually what the council is set up to do. When we looked at our role in the regulatory arena, for example, we're an advisor to the Department of Defense and the Department of Commerce. So we worry about the intelligence community's equities, and we try to have a light touch on the creation of licenses for our firms. But the philosophy of making sure our firms are paramount in the commercial marketplace means we may have to be the ones to adapt rather than trying to restrict what they're doing. So the council is first and foremost a way for our agencies to come together, understand what the impacts are of emerging commercial capabilities, and first of all, figure out how to do no harm. Second of all, how to figure out how to take advantage of it where appropriate, and then work to illuminate for our leaders how commercial space capabilities are going to be a game changer. And so it's rapidly evolving. We want to get ahead of the curve and not react. And by the time a capability shows up in a formal license, it has been germinated for some time. And now we're in a regulatory structure in which we're required to react to a license with its specificity. What we want to do is have the headlight high beams go way out and see what's coming long before it shows up as a license. Number one, so we can take advantage of it. And number two, so we can plan to adapt rather than have to say no to that license. So the council is a forum for strategy, policy development, and coordination across the community. We will bring in commercial providers because I think it's part and parcel of our duty to our leaders that they hear directly from those providing those breakthrough capabilities. And so we're going to have the council reach out where appropriate and bring in commercial capabilities and proponents of commercial capabilities. And it'll be a forum for our leadership to get educated and then turn around and help guide and give direction to the practitioners in the community about what we can do about that.
That's fantastic. One last question for you, and then any wrap-up comments you might have. Let's see, I'm getting a warning notice that we're about to lose our time here. So why don't I turn immediately to you, JP, if you have any closing remarks you'd like to make, and then I'll just do a quick out brief here.
I don't have anything prepared, but what I would tell you from the heart is that I looked at the attendance list here today, and many of you are my colleagues and friends, and many of you are just as passionate as I am about space and its importance to the nation. I grew up as a kid thinking about the space program, wishing I could have been an astronaut, and watching the great space race that took place when I was a young man. What's happening now to me is just as important to national security as it was to our national aspirations back in the 60s, that we be dominant in space. The more I've learned, the more I've come to recognize our job is not only to understand it, but to explain it to people and to have the momentum that we've created over the last 3 years continue forward. I think we're at a precipice right now of understanding and recognition that we've got to get our act together on space. We cannot coast anymore. We had a leadership, very strong leadership in space for many, many decades. But it's very clear to me now, we will lose that leadership if we don't take strong, decisive action. And it has to be done whole of nation, whole of government, with all of us together. And I look forward to working with everybody here and everybody who's participated and at NSSA to make that a continuing success going forward.
Well, that's great. This has been a tremendous discussion. Thank you for your efforts, JP, your appearance today. And we would love to have you. A lot of these issues can delve into classified information. We'd love to have you in a future classified session when convenient for you. So please keep us in mind for that. But very enlightening today. And for those watching, thank you for being with us. On behalf of the National Security Space Association, over and out. JP, thank you so much. Everybody have a great day. We'll see you again soon.
Thank you, Chris.